Is waste and bureaucratic bloat a big problem for any government in the United Kingdom? And is cutting the fat a job for technocrats or for the elected officials? Well, listening to that interview and joining us now is Alex Thomas, Programme Director of the Institute for Government. Alex, good afternoon. Thank you for giving us your time.
Hi, Alexis. Thanks for having me.
You heard there from Michael Fabricant saying, look, you can be someone with a vision, but if you don't have the support of Whitehall, if you don't have the support of the civil service, well, that vision is not going to come to fruition. Do you agree with that?
Well, look, I think Michael Fabricant adds enormously to the entertainment of the nation, but I think some of the things he said about the civil service there were just kind of completely wrong and verging on conspiracy theories. So, of course, you need the elected politicians in the government and the civil service to work together. But the idea that there's some sort of great massive opposition doing its own thing in the kind of, yes, Minister Sir Humphrey way that Michael Fabricant talked about is just completely wrong. What there is, and where I do agree with what he and some of what Dominic Cummings was saying, of course there are inefficiencies. Of course there are things that don't work as well as they should. There are all sorts of ways. The task of improving government and making it more efficient and effective is a never-ending one. And quite a lot of perhaps not the Michael Fabricant diagnosis, but the Dominic Cummings diagnosis is right. We do need more people with more specific skills in government. We do need a civil service that is receptive to the priorities of government and politicians that are able to set that agenda and to lead. But clearly Dominic Cummings had a chance and it didn't work out. The problem with the sort of Cummings Fabricant view of the world is you blow everything up. You're tearing things apart without rebuilding them. So while I agree with the Cummings diagnosis, I think his solutions are somewhat off the reservation, and I really don't think we should take a Musk approach to reforming government the way that's being talked about.
But it is true, though, that every government in recent memory has talked about waste in the civil service, a sort of a bloated government that needs to be trimmed, and yet pretty much every government has failed to do so. So why is it so difficult? You could argue that Dominic Cummings has the approach of, well, let's blow it all up, because everything else has not worked.
Well, there was a government between 2010 and 2015 with David Cameron and the Coalition and Francis Maude that did reduce the size of the civil service a lot, made quite a lot of efficiency savings. This stuff is doable, but it requires kind of persistent application. One of the things I'd like to try and do with this, in this discussion that we have about the civil service is disentangle those things that sound to me like an excuse for failure or blaming the civil service or finding easy answers. Well, we don't want to raise taxes or cut spending, so let's find efficiencies in the civil service, and sort of using that as an excuse from the real things that are wrong with the civil service. Civil servants move around too much. They don't develop the expertise. One of the points I agreed with Michael Fabricant on there actually was strengthening the Cabinet Office. Nobody really runs the civil service. There is no source of authority in the centre. We talk about the Cabinet Secretary or the head of the civil service, but actually the civil service is quite a distributed system in individual departments and under different secretaries of state and permanent secretaries. There's a lot of stuff that we can talk about here, but it gets wrapped up in the whole sort of, as I say, kind of excuse finding and blame shifting and looking for easy answers rather than just the kind of hard graft of governing.
Well, I want to focus on that blame shifting that you mentioned there. And I don't know whether this is at all realistic, but would we benefit from more transparency from the civil service? And what I'm referring to there is we've often heard ministers say, well, I wanted to do X, Y, Z, but it was only the dastardly civil service that told me, no, I can't do all these things that I promised the electorate. Well, do we need a bit more transparency about what the civil service actually advised a minister or a secretary of state was possible and what was, well, frankly, against the law?
I think that's a really, really interesting question, and I think it would be helpful because, we tend to only see these things years or decades afterwards when people write memoirs, and lots of civil servants never talk about these things, so we don't really know what goes on. But I worry a bit. Transparency, yes, but I worry a bit about closing down the space inside government that ministers and civil servants need to kind of hash things out. So in the moment, I think it's right to keep things private. The word I'd really like to pick up on, I think, is accountability. I think in the British system, it's quite easy, and this goes to the sort of blame shifting stuff, for ministers to blame civil servants and civil servants to blame ministers. And that's partly because we're not really kind of laser-like focused on who is accountable for what. So one of the things I would like to see about the civil service is more clarity about what civil servants are responsible for and therefore what we and Parliament should be holding them to account for. So I think the sort of management of the state, the boring stuff, the IT functions, the processes, the capability, if you like, of the state. I think we should say, actually, that is on you, civil servants. You shouldn't be expecting ministers to do all of that, but we want to hold civil servants more publicly to account for the effectiveness of that. And I think that would be a healthier sort of debate than the things that we sometimes get into.
Alex, just before we go, there is another piece that's causing some ripples in today's Sunday Times. It's based on the Gabriel Pogrund and Patrick Maguire book called Get In. It is the story of Sir Keir Starmer trying to stop the BBC revealing that he earned less than Sue Gray, one of the top civil servants in the government. What are your thoughts on that? There is a discussion going on now about how much we pay civil servants. Is it right that a civil servant can earn more than the Prime Minister? Do you have a view on how we remunerate civil servants, whether we should be paying them more?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, that story, one of the reactions to that story in particular was it just seemed to be an awful lot of very, very senior people, up to the Cabinet Secretary and the Prime Minister, spending quite a lot of time on this, which I thought was remarkable. So maybe crack on with governing rather than worrying about salaries. But on your question, I think, I mean, the whole sort of, are they paid more than the Prime Minister? The fact is we probably don't pay the Prime Minister enough. We should pay the Prime Minister a little bit more, but there are all sorts of kind of presentational and political reasons why you don't do that. Civil service pay in real terms has dramatically dropped over the last few years with inflation and pay restraint. I do think there is a good case for rewarding those most successful civil servants more, but also for kind of keeping the salary generally competitive. And that's for sort of quite self-interested reasons, not from the civil services point of view, but for good government point of view. Because one of the things we've seen, we published some research on this the other day, is if you hold down the salaries of civil servants in different grades, the incentives are then to promote people more quickly, which hollows out the capability of the state. So I think in suppressing civil service salaries, we're actually contributing to all of these problems of government effectiveness that we've been talking about.
Okay. Alex, fascinating to speak to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Alex Thomas there, Programme Director for the Institute for Government.